speaker is unusual. He's a Navy person. But as I learnt more from reading his wonderful book, a bloody job well done. The Navy contribution to the helicopter war, Australia's was part of the American helicopter war in Vietnam, was not insignificant. The one that met Speedy is an observer. I noticed the current sense of this, Max, is an observer, a pilot, and a seaman officer, and has served on Her Majesty's Australian ships Melbourne 2, Sydney 3, the aircraft carriers, Parramatta 2, and Vampire, where he was the executive officer. He served on most of the Fleet Air Arm squadrons, 723, 724, 725, 816 and 817, and has over 200 arrested deck landings and catapult launches and about 4,500 hours of flying time. He's flown as piloting commander of over a dozen naval aircraft, including jets and helicopters, and as he let me know before I came up here, he flew that Wessex over there as well. He assisted in the rescue of sailors from the Melbourne Voyager collision on 10th February 1964. And after 20 years in the Navy, he went into local government as a town planner and spent time as the Shire President and member of various other organisations in paid and unpaid capacities. He's very modestly not gone into detail in his biography about his time in Vietnam, and I'll let him talk about that and the experience of the Navy contingent. Max Speedy.
Thanks for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and I feel honoured to be able to talk to you today. My talk, my talk is about a virtually unknown group of Royal Australian Navy Fleet Air Arm personnel who were attached to the American Army's 135th Assault Helicopter Company in Vietnam from 67 through to 71. I'll give you a few reflections of my own and mainly, hopefully, cover how the US Army used its helicopters. And my talk does come from a lot of the stuff in this book, which was just mentioned. Now, the point of this slide is to give you an idea of just how big that war was. This is a compilation of the US and Free World Forces, as they were known at the time, versus the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong on the other. And the numbers were very roughly 1-to-1. And for comparison purposes, the Iraq Desert Storm numbers are up there, where the Americans had roughly a 3-to-1 ratio. Whilst the technology you may ascribe to the Americans in Vietnam should have given them the advantage when it came to a fight on the ground, we were pretty well evenly matched. Bearing in mind then that I'm talking about US Army Aviation, this is the picture of the 4 aviation brigades which were in Vietnam around the 1968 Tet 1 time and where they were located. Now I was part of, a very small part of, 1st Aviation Brigade, which was the largest of the lot, and it had half of 2 Corps all the way down to the very south, and the other 3 brigades had the northern 2 Corps and I Corps to the north. Has anyone ever read Chicken Hawk? Robert Mason's iconic book. If you haven't and you're going to want this book, then get Chicken Hawk. It'll tell you exactly the same stuff. Now, the transition from 32 helicopters of doubtful capability in 1961 didn't happen easily. A major study in 1962, I'm talking about American Army, nothing else. A major study in 1962 said that the Army should be put in and taken out of battle and supplied in battle by helicopters. not to say that there weren't turf wars, there were plenty of them, and between the US Army and the US Air Force, they were the most significant at the time. The Air Force was saying that only its aircraft could provide support to the helicopters whilst those helicopters were airborne. Once the troops were on the ground, then the Army could take over. There was a battle which was fought for quite a while, but eventually an agreement was signed off between the chiefs of US Army and Air Force so that Army was able to look after its helicopters and everything that went with them, including research and development. And the Air Force had, for its part, took over Army's Caribou aircraft. And as an aside to that, the 135th was a Caribou company, but was transformed at Fort Hood in Texas to the 135th Assault Helicopter Company, of which I became a part later on. Well, you slipped, no, that's fine, sorry, I'll go back, my fault. From 1965, when the war really did start to escalate, this organisation was stood up, and in the 3 years to 1969, which is the picture you're looking at here, 1st Aviation Brigade grew to 4,500 officers and warrant officers and 19,500 soldiers. In 1969, the 1st Aviation Brigade flew 1 million hours, and the 135th contributed about 35,000 of those hours to that effort. Each Combat Aviation Battalion, the 222nd in this case, was assigned to a US Infantry Division. In our case, again, the 9th US Infantry, as well as the 9th South Vietnamese Infantry, both located in the Mekong Delta. So, how did a simple sailor get to be with an American Army unit? Well, there are a number of threads to this. First of all, Navy had considered commissioning a new squadron of Hueys to support Army in Vietnam. But when it was realised, for better or for worse, that the helicopters would be surplus at war's end, the idea was dropped. The RAF also wanted the Americans to provide 4 Hueys to RAF that they could fly, but the US rejected that. And then Navy went to the Americans and said, well, what about we give you some Navy pilots and maintainers to reduce your logistics chain? And the Americans said yes, and from that the RAN Helicopter Flight Vietnam was formed. Additionally, the RAF got 8 of our pilots, and they served in the 9 Squadron between May 68 and April 1969. But of the contingents of the helicopter flight that went to Vietnam, 4 of them, Navy, as best it could understand the situation, and it didn't, formed a small squadron. 8 pilots, 4 observers, 4 air crewmen, quite a bunch of quite senior maintainers, chief petty officers, people who've been in the Navy for 15 and 20 odd years and clearly had a great deal of experience. We had a cook, a steward, a pay office person to look after our pay, a sick berth attendant, and even a photographer. And we joined the 135th. Now this is my group. I was in the 2nd contingent. And the EMU thing, our logo, was an experimental, it was an acronym from the Experimental Military Unit, which we were, the experiment between the Army, US Army and the Royal Australian Navy. The Americans, they were a bit miffed when they worked out the bird couldn't fly. But in any event, it was a call sign we grew to love and were certainly very proud of it. The 1st contingent went to Vietnam in October 1967. It was based in Bang Tao for about 3 months, at which time pretty well all the work that the 135th did was with the Australian Army. In January, 1st of January 1968, the 135th moved north of Phuoc Tuy province to Blackhorse, Camp Blackhorse, and when I got there in September of '68, for my year, I only ever did 4 lifts with the Australian Army. The rest of the time, the 135th operated with US Army and South Vietnamese, about 50-50. And at that point, we lost pretty well all contact with the Australians, except for the resupply of beer. In December '68, we moved yet again from Black Horse to Bear Cat, which was reasonably close to Saigon. And the reason for these moves, it wasn't the last move, because a year later, the 135th moved properly into the Delta, at a place called Dong Tan, which is a pretty big base. That was our AO, that was where we were operating. Now, in accordance with the American-Australian agreement that was in place between ourselves and the Americans, our officer in charge of the helicopter flight was the executive officer of the 135th. And we were so well integrated that when the CO of the 135th, a major, went on leave, our lieutenant commander actually took command of the unit. And the rest of us in positions of authority, aircraft captains, platoon leaders, gunship team leaders, maintenance team chiefs and leaders and so forth, we had the positions of authority that went with all of that. After I'd done my 300 hours of co-pilot's time, which took about 3 months, and a point that was made by Robin Kitchener, regardless of rank, and I had plenty of it comparatively, I was a lieutenant, we all flew with experienced pilots in that first 300 hours. I flew with a warrant officer who taught me pretty well how to fly. But after the 3 months, I became a platoon leader. First platoon, I had 10 aircraft, 20 warrant officers and 40 crew chiefs and gunners underneath me. That lasted for about 4 or 5 months, and then I moved up to become the operations officer. And with that position, the CO, the XO and myself flew the command and control aeroplane as air mission commander, pretty well 1 in 3, and when I wasn't flying in that job, I was back flying slicks as slick leader. I did, by the way, fly pretty well every other aeroplane they had in Vietnam at the time. I did a little bit of time in gunships, but most of the time really was in slicks. Now, each of our contingent leaders had a directive from Chief of Navy. It was long on admin and all that sort of stuff, but the important aspect of it is the bit in bold there, should you be imperilled, etc., etc. Now, it was impossible guidance to follow. Some of us would be flying as co-pilot with an American in command of the aeroplane. Just as often I'd be in command with an American crew, but I was only one in a team of 15 aeroplanes up on the day. And there was no way in hell you could abort a mission just because it was imperiling you. Because if nothing else, the backseat commander in the command and control aircraft, the battalion commander, whose troops we were actually putting into battle, was actually commanding you to put my troops in such and such a place. Now, it was, we just didn't have the authority not to follow those instructions. And simply thought anyway, whilst there was plenty of frequent discussion about whether we should or shouldn't land here, maybe there, we always had a common cause. You couldn't know if a landing zone was going to be hot until you arrived in it anyway, and so in the final analysis we just ignored the Chief of Navy's directive. Now, rules of engagement have been touched on very briefly. I can't see a thing here. Is that actually showing up right? Yeah, okay. Sorry. The first part of it stated that you can only use fire defensively, but when it was realised that the war was getting a damn sight hotter than that, then the rules were changed, as you can see on the slide. So the practice that we used came down to this. Depending on where we were operating, we would use suppressive fire without normally taking any enemy fire first up. The nipper palm edges of most of the Delta landing zones and the edges of jungle clearings are cases in point, and they're pretty well always booby-trapped. So we fired first. That was rule 1, and rule 2 was referred to rule 1. If one helicopter reported taking fire, then it was usual for all 10 to return it, as well as the gunships. There was also fairly strict instructions both in the American MAC-B rules as well as our own directive, that we weren't allowed anywhere near the Cambodian border. Well, we frequently flew to the border, a couple of times went over it, supposedly in hot pursuit would have caused Mary Hill had we been shot down, but that didn't happen. But at the same time, pretty well all the other American units that we were with were flying certainly into Cambodia occasionally and into Laos all the time. In May 1970 though, Commander Australian Forces located safely in Saigon ordered us, not me, I beg your pardon, the third contingent, I'd long gone by this stage, ordered the third contingent that they were not to take part in the open invasion of Cambodia, which was about to take place in May. Much to the annoyance of the Australians and the Americans in the 135th, because they didn't have enough American pilots to act as aircraft commanders. So they had to take the whole of the 135th out of the operation, much to everybody's disgust. Our standard mission was a day in, day out thing, and it rarely changed. We would be given our area of operations each day, each evening for the next day's work. And really the only thing that changed was who we were picking them up and what time do we have to be there. Generally it was a battalion move, which we would do in 3 lifts. We had 10 slicks, so we'd take 10 people at a hit, 100 people in 100 men in a company, 3 companies to a battalion. That's how we worked. And that's what we would do. And we would support these guys exclusively all day. We were with the battalion, we'd stay with them. Whatever they needed, we would do. Medevac, resupply, and take them home at night when that happened. Occasionally we'd get these pigs and rice or hash and trash missions where individual aircraft would be sent out to do something for somebody who had no bloody idea how to use us effectively, and frequently very, very dangerous operations. And I've probably operated further from home base on some of these days than I ever did with the group as a whole. I've been right up into the middle of 2 Corps in the mountain areas working with the Montagnards doing these hash and trash jobs, and I can tell you it's not fun. The daily routine was pretty standard. 4:30 we would be down at our aircraft to pre-flight them. If they would start up, we would go and have breakfast, get briefed, and eventually get airborne at about 6. The maintainers would have our aircraft in that intervening period if we couldn't get them to work properly, and then off we'd go for our mission. Command and control, which was a Huey like the one out here, with a great big console of radios for the battalion commander in the back. 4 gunships would go off, and then we would follow in the slicks and do our work. If we were really far away, as we frequently were over on the Cambodian border, then we would take a spare aircraft with us in case we had to replace one of them during the day. Next please. There we go. This is our first home, Camp Blackhorse, just 20 miles north of the border of Phuoc Tuy province. It was also home for Colonel Patton's 11th Armoured Cav, son of the General with Daddy's pearl-handled 45s. And this is home sweet home, with our little personal bunkers nearby. There were no bunk tower villas for us. Thought I'd throw that one in, but I had to. No problem at all. And we had all the mod cons. Next. Now, you haven't lived until you've sat on a 5-hole gunny and read your news or played checkers with your neighbour. Now, in a few places, Vietnam was quite a beautiful country, but the prevailing landscape was more like this. This is the Cu Chi Tunnels area, well northwest of Saigon. There was a base called Cu Chi, and it was in part of it was very close to this, and directly underneath all this lot was one of the biggest DSC tunnel complexes in the whole of the world. And this was the American response to getting rid of those underground cities. I was up there one day operating here as CNC and saw a line of 500-pounders start smacking into the ground with time delays, and it damn near got one of the gunships, and they were very lucky to get out of the way. We just missed the call that there was a raid on the way. I mean, those guys just did what they wanted and didn't ask anybody's say-so. Now, the crew of the Huey was 2 pilots, in case one of them was shot, a crew chief of a leading seaman equivalent rank who went with the aeroplane. It's basically his aeroplane. He did all the maintenance, first line maintenance on it, rotor hub greasings and keeping it clean and cleaning filters and all that sort of stuff. And he manned one of the M60s. The 4th member was a gunner of seaman equivalent rank, and he looked after the M60s, and he was the 4th member. Us pilots, we had a Smith & Wesson 38 Police Special. Its best place, because there was no room in the seat we had, was to stick it right there for obvious reasons. And when we were shot down, we would get the M16s, which were the personal weapons of the backseat crew, and those guys would look after the M60s until we were picked up. The landing zone preparation was usually 105 millimetre artillery, and just about the whole of Vietnam was covered in one way or other by either 105s or 155s, 155s. And we'd get about 10 minutes of prep before a landing zone. It would stop maybe 30 seconds before the gunships and we arrived. Smokey, you would hope, would put a screen down on if there was going to be a hot side. I hope you got it right. And then we would land. Occasionally we would get a landing zone prep by fighters, American fighters, Air Force guys, almost on call off a taxi rank. I remember one classic day, a pair of Phantoms ripped down one side, a pair of Super Sodas down the other, with bombs and napalm, and we landed about 10 or 20 seconds after that. I did take part in an 80 aircraft assault one day. That's 80 aircraft and 16 gunships. It was 8 companies, and I think that was more for the benefit of the Commanding General of 12th Group, but hey, it looked good. Most of the time, though, it was just 10 aircraft, us and the battalion that we were working with. Occasionally, we'd get together with 2 companies and 20 aircraft, but this was 10 was the normal deal. This is one of our gunship types, a UH-1C with 38 2.75-inch rockets, and occasionally a Frog 40mm grenade launcher in the front, that little bubble thing on the front of the aircraft. It was called Thumper because it really did thump the hell out of the aeroplane, and it was the most difficult thing in the world to aim accurately because of the time of flight of the shell, but it was still a fairly good weapon. But our preferred model was this one, 14 rockets, miniguns, one on either side, which could be aimed out of arc, which could be aimed about 25 degrees either side of the nose. And if you wanted to go further around, you could get to about 45 or so degrees. That one would ramp up to 4,000 rounds a minute, and the other one, fortunately, would stop whilst it was out of arc. Trouble was, and there was a reference made to the all-up weights of the aircraft flying, we would always load full fuel and full armament and then work out how to take off. And for the aficionados, we would frequently take off with the beeper right on the stops. Very occasionally, you'd even get the crew chief and gunner to get out and run beside the aeroplane until it got enough bouncing, thumping along the ground, and just at that moment critique the guys that leap on and you get away and pick up revs and so on. But these things were so heavy that they could only ever fly at about 70 knots flat out, which was 20 knots slower than us, and when the Huey Cobra, the AH-1G, finally came into service, it was certainly a faster, better, more accurate platform. The forerunner of our Apache, the Apache and our Tiger. It was a great platform, but even so, that wasn't a bad aeroplane to have at your side. Now, flying for so many hours a day meant that our formations were pretty loose, same way, same day generally. But when we got to the landing zones, we obviously always closed up to about one rotor's distance apart. Night combat assaults were something we all hated with a passion. They weren't easy to do. Flying formation as we were, we only had very dim top nav lights on the adjacent aircraft to formate off, and so without doors on, we would use the instrument panel of the nearest aeroplane. If you could read his instruments, you were too close. If you couldn't, you were too far away. As for height references, though, we didn't have night vision goggles, we didn't have radar altimeters, and all you really had to hope for was a bit of moonlight off the rice paddies. We wouldn't use our landing lights, that always drew fire. It was a bit like a candle to the moth. And I got about 85 hours night combat assaults, which was more than enough. Now, the next point I make on this picture is the fixed mounted M60. All new gunners had to do their time there because it was on fixed mounts, you couldn't fire into the aeroplane and all the rest of it. But the reason for that was if you wanted to graduate to be a gunship gunner, you had to do your time in slits because these fellas had their M60 hung off the roof, so that these guys could and had to get out onto the side of the aeroplane to fire underneath the nose, and certainly when breaking over the target, back under your tail, as that was your most vulnerable point. And I can remember one day when I was flying gunships, one of them put a round through the nose of the aeroplane, which caused a little bit of excitement. And some other occasion, not when I was around, one of the guys hit a rocket as it was going out the tube, and that really did cause some spectacular confusion. Now, landing zones like this were pretty common currency for us. This is down in the Union Forest on the western border of Four Corps. It was a BC North Vietnamese stronghold. We went down there, we fought our daily battles down there, and nothing ever changed because we had to go back the next day and repeat the whole business yet again. In the wet season, this is what the Delta looked like. The whole of the Mekong is only about 5, maybe 10 feet above sea level, and there are no landmarks there other than the river, the canals, which you got used to very quickly. There's nothing anything above 5 or 10 feet except when you get to the border for the Seven Mountains area, which is another BC stronghold, or up into the jungles of Tukul. And it's right at this spot where you've got troops just getting out of the aeroplane that the North Vietnamese or Viet Cong would pop out of that hut there and throw a rocket-propelled grenade at you, and then instantly you're committed to this spot. Either a helicopter crew to be rescued, but certainly troops who have been wounded or killed on the ground that you're going to have to either support and eventually get out. Okay, now that's a bit of the theory of how we did these things. Let me just give you a little bit of how we practiced it. One of my pilots was killed, and Sub-Lieutenant Jed Hart came up to replace him about a week or so later. And Jed has written his story in the book here, but I'll just read you a tiny little amount of what he did say about his very first combat assault. He was flying with me. Later, with hundreds of combat assaults under my belt, I wouldn't recall one PZ or LZ from another. But that day, I remember our air mission commander guiding the lead ship of the flight to land short of the 3 burning helicopters. I thought about our Australian workup where we trundled happily into land in neat formation and hovered gently down onto the grass. When you're training, of course, the machine gun rounds only go in one direction and no one's shooting back. This wasn't like that at all. There were rockets and minigun being pumped into the tree lines bordering our LZ by our own light fire team. And our machine gunners and crew chiefs were hammering away with M60s as hard as they could go from every slick, but we were still under heavy fire. When you're in a flight of 10 helicopters, you aren't weaving and ducking. You're following your leader, slowing down and coming to a halt. You like where the shooting is. It wasn't a comfortable feeling. The helicopters stayed in the hopper for seconds while troops were hurled out into the paddies. It was done quickly, but we were still no faster than the slowest ship. Once we'd completed our first insertion, we flew off for another load so we could do it all over again. Bloody hell, I thought. And apparently, I said, welcome to Vietnam. Now, this is a dry summer rice paddy, and the North Vietnamese could be hiding in rice stoops as they did on the 18th of May 1968, a place called Tan An, southwest of Saigon. On the first lift, 10 aircraft, 100 troops, 6 aircraft were downed. On the next lift, 4 aircraft remaining and another 40 troops. One of the aeroplanes takes 25 hits. Only one air crewman was injured in all this lot. Of the 140 troops of the 25th Armored Division who were taken in there were 125 casualties. They were pretty sure that the information on that landing zone had been picked up from information that was passed down by landline to our company ops from battalion the night before. Because of the Vietnamese ran the telephone exchanges. We changed our way of doing business a little bit after that, I have to admit. Okay, this is Mick Perrott. He's eating our lovely sea rations. That was staple fare for us for a year. Mick, sorry?
You work that well.
Well, possibly, yeah. Mick had a full load of fuel and troops on board one day, about 500 feet, when his engine blew up, and he did an immaculate landing into a tiny little spot that was almost directly beneath him and didn't even bend. Now, you'll meet Mick in a moment. When we were shot down, and if the area was secure, and we used our own people to secure our own aircraft when we did go down, if it was secure, then we'd get one of these guys in. The 147th Hill Climbers did our work for us. They could get us out in about an hour, and that was pretty exceptional service. This is Bob Kyle's aeroplane. He had been shot down, and he took his camera pretty well everywhere with him. This is taken down through the hellhole in the Chinook of his aeroplane, and just as he'd taken the photo and was walking forward, there was a bit of a jolt, and someone said, "Whoops," and they dropped his aeroplane. So they didn't bother going back to try and pick it up. It wasn't any use. And you'll meet Bob in a moment as well. Now, the 4 people here, all gunship pilots, but the 2 of interest are Rick Simmons on the left, Tom Supple with the fag in his hand sitting down. There's 2 cigarettes in that aeroplane, you might note. Smoking was never a problem in those days. It's only the bureaucrats who've changed things today. Anyway, this is Tom Supple's story. He and Rick were flying together as Aussies with American backseat crew on this particular day. Late one afternoon, our gunship was hit by a 50 cal machine gun. Traces the size of golf balls crashed through the perspex, and we were on our way down. Clearing the crash site, we took cover behind a rice dyke, defending ourselves as best we could with the weapons at hand. We were on our own and would soon be overrun by the advancing North Vietnamese troops. Now, as an aside here, if you're shot down and lucky enough to survive in North Vietnam, you would most likely make it to the Hanoi Hilton. But in the south, it was just too much trouble to take helicopter pilots there, so there was a bounty on our heads, and for good reason, you didn't want that to be claimed. So back to the story. I don't know what, if any, discussion took place between Mick Perrott and Bob Kyle, but they were well aware that by coming to our area, it was odds on that they wouldn't survive the attempt. In spite of extremely heavy and constant enemy fire, they did manage to effect a dramatic and skillful rescue of all four of us. There were some relatively minor gunshot wounds, and their very well ventilated helicopter didn't fly again for a long time. Thanks, fellas, forever indebted. It was pretty well like 4th of July or Australia or New Year's Eve in Sydney on this particular, right on dusk, and there was tracer going everywhere. But Mick and Bob did a phenomenal job, and those guys are very lucky. That made front pages, by the way, on the newspapers back home. Now, I haven't to date said very much about the maintainers. We had an amazing crew of people with us, and these guys did absolute wonders under really appalling conditions. Wet or dry, day or night, and mostly out in the open is how they did their maintenance for us. And we had the aeroplanes, remember, from 4:30 in the morning until whenever we brought them home. And my longest flying day was 13 and a half hours. So you add all that up with a couple of tiny breaks in between. That means you got those aeroplanes for a very long time. I don't think I got back until close to midnight that night. And that wasn't sort of uncommon, but that was the longest of any of them. These guys only had the aeroplanes for there for a short period of time. Each helicopter company was supported, American helicopter company was supported on the basis, according to the Pentagon, of 1,500 hours flying per month. And we and pretty well all the others were flying between 3,600 and 4,100 hours a month. And as a result, the store's resupply was pretty well just unable to cope. And as a consequence, we had one aeroplane that was going around trading. I'll give you two of these for one of those sort of things to keep our aircraft flying. Expressly prohibited, but we ignored it because the demand was you would provide 15 aeroplanes every day. And we were down to 17 out of our 31 at one stage and still put up 15. So these guys did well. These guys did remarkably well. Okay, here's a little bit of a reality check. This is Bob Merkley, an American warrant officer. Slide says it all. Oh, it doesn't. Well, he was shot down 3 times before he had his 21st birthday. I won't be smiling. And the next one, please. Well, I'm going to give you a bit of a diary of events which concern just the Australians here. But remember this, Australian or American, we were always flying together with no segregation, and we all had American crew anyway. Starting with the 8th of January 1968, 3 aircraft shot down, and Bruce Crawford gets 25 hits to his aeroplane. He gets a Distinguished Service Cross for that, and a Specialist 4th Class, Gary Wetzel, WETZL, gets a Congressional Medal of Honor. 12th of January, 1 aircraft shot down. Leading Airman Wardle and French are both wounded. 8th of February, 68, 8 aircraft knocked out. 2 of them crashed, 4 people were killed and 2 more wounded. 22nd of February, Lieutenant Commander Pat Vickers, our first casualty, was killed. 18th of April, 11 aircraft are hit and 2 shot down. 18th of May, 10 aircraft are hit, 6 go down, 125 troops are wounded, I've referred to that. 19th of June, Lieutenants Leake and Craig, who were both with 9 Squadron at one stage, but were with us on this particular one. But Leake and Craig and Leading Air Crew and Green spiral in from 1,500 feet with a 4th, an American member on board. They survived. God alone knows how they survived, but they did. And they were picked up by an Air Force crew, for which they're eternally grateful. 8th of August, 68, one of the gunships is hit by a rocket-propelled grenade, and Piotr Phillips on the right, and Lieutenant Tony Casadillo on the bottom right are both killed, along with 2 more Americans. On the 23rd of October, we have what we euphemistically call the Battle of Ben Tre. That was a sod of a place to go to. It was another VC. It was basically the VC capital of South Vietnam. 14 aircraft to hit on this one. 3 slicks and 2 gunships go down, and we had to call in reinforcements. 23rd of December, day after my first wedding anniversary. I lead a counter-attack on a South Vietnamese company that's surrounded by North Vietnamese Army battalion, and we all get a few hits for our trouble there, and I have to go back in a couple of minutes later and pick up some medevacs. All very interesting stuff. It takes us up to January 69, From January 69 to April 69, about 120 days, there wasn't a day went past when one of our aeroplanes didn't take a hit. On the 3rd of January, Sub-Lieutenant Tony Hewlin and his crew of 3 are killed. On the 15th of January, I get shot down. On the 2nd of February, Tom Supple and Rick Simmons are shot down and rescued by Mick Perrott and Bob Kyle. On the 13th of February, another gunship gets shot down, and I go and rescue these guys. This one was almost funny. Almost. I had a brand new gun on the right-hand side of me. Probably couldn't understand a word I was saying. I mean, these guys came into country and were flying pretty well the next day. He could probably hardly understand a word I said. But in any event, I'm going and try and pick these guys up. Command and Control's up above me, jamming up the radio, saying, I can only see 3 crew. Where's the 4th crew? Get the 4th crew, and da-da-da-da-da-da. And the guy's saying, sir, I think they're shooting at us. What do I do? And anyway, he did eventually get himself organised, and we got in there and picked the crew up. The aeroplane was actually burning when I got there. We got the crew out all right. That wasn't too much of a drama. But then the fire inexplicably went out, and they had to go and pick the aeroplane up, which eventually get it, which caused some trouble. All right, that was a bit of a diversion. 22nd of February, 69, Rick Simmons, that gunship guy, he gets wounded, but comes back to the fray a month later. On the 31st of May, Lieutenant Crewman Noel Ship and his crew are shot down. It's ship there, bottom left, no shirt and holding the rocket. He is best known to my group, but increasingly so to the Australian public these days. Very recently, Chip was one of 13 who were proposed for a posthumous VC. Excuse me. The Recruit School of Service, welcome the Navy today, thank you for coming, is going to honour Ship by calling one of their divisions after him. I think that's great. 21st of July, 1969, let me remember what happened. Apollo moon landing. And the war stopped pretty well. We were all watching the landing on these tiny little black and white TV screens. And I mean to say there were only, I think, 2 or 3 other days declared for non-combat operations. Christmas Day was one, Easter Sunday was the other. It happened on this day with Apollo moon landing. And I'm not sure about Thanksgiving, but many of them, there weren't many days off. I mentioned the 21st of July because on the 22nd of July, another slick of mine goes down and kills everybody on board. And so it went on. Nearly finished. Some statistics for you now. Just basically of the year that I was there, 35,000 hours, over 250,000 troops. I got 1,250 hours for my year there, and all of us pilots were getting about the same. Lots of aircraft destroyed and heaps damaged. 13 killed, 22 wounded, of the total 135th, including 2 Australians killed and 5 wounded in my year there. That was a casualty about every 10 days, so you were fairly focused on what you were doing. The helicopter flight Vietnam in its 4 years there, 5 killed, 25 wounded. Now this next bit is a bit of a dodgy statistic, but it's accurate enough. Of the 50 of us aircrew who were flying all the time, and the observers, and I don't wish to denigrate them because I am or was one, but the observers were used in non-flying roles most of the time. Of the 50 of us who were flying, there were 30 casualties, and that's a pretty disproportionate rate. Dust-offs were spoken about earlier on. In the first half of 1968, nearly 100,000. It was double the annual rate for the 2 previous years, and the reason for that was Tet, the Tet offensive of February 1968. I've got some different, slightly different numbers to the one that Bob, they were your numbers, I think. Someone's numbers, I beg your pardon. We're talking about the number of aircraft in Vietnam, and I think you came up with 11,000. Yeah. I won't argue as to who's right, but these are my stats, so right now I'm right. We can find it out later. But my point is that that's my source, the Vietnam Helo Pilots Association. 2,200 aircrew killed out of a total of 58,000 Americans. And at least 100 American soldiers were being killed in a good week, and up to 600 in a bad week. And ultimately, the American public called for stop. I said on my busiest day, I flew 13 and a half hours. It wasn't uncommon to fly 10 and 12 at a stretch for days on end. I was flying an aircraft that was pretty simple, but it was great, and we loved it. It was a war where the philosophy was what you had was okay, more was better, and too much was just about right. In closing, I had the pleasure to fly in the Vietnam Vets Parade in Adelaide in 2007 with my son. And it was pleasing to me anyway to note that I could still hover, albeit under his very watchful eye. We used to say that if you couldn't hover or tap dance, you were queer. Thank you very much for listening to me.
We've got time for 1 or 2 questions before we break for lunch. Anyone like to kick off? Yes?
On the door gunners, they've taken the butt off the M60s and put the hand grips on. If you crashed and you had to protect your own vehicle, it's very difficult to fire an M60 with 2 handholds at the back of the M60 rather than in a lying position.
Bullshit, if you're around the street, you'll fire it anyway.
Is that a question?
So we used to hang on to it like this. We used to hang on to the yards and just under the hip, 40 Murphy stuff, and it worked all right. None of this aimed bloody fire. Watch where the traces are going.
Another question on this one?
Max, you haven't touched on the cultural issue of being a maritime helicopter pilot going into the land environment and full-on combat. Yeah, but not exactly the same.
Look, the only thing that distinguished us from Americans was beards, and we made a point of having big, dirty, rotten beards, and mine was as good as any, and our accents. We were very well indoctrinated into them, into their culture. I mean, it was their aeroplanes, it was all of their stuff. We had to meld in, but we were good at our job. I mean, sure, I was only a lieutenant, and I was still very young, but I was a lot older, and I had a lot more experience than the warrant officer pilots, who were the majority of these people in all of the helicopter companies, who had had a 35-week course on how to fly a helicopter after a fashion. You're off to Vietnam, son, and none of this a week to or a fortnight to enculturate yourself. Like Jed Hart, who flew with me on that particular day, these guys are in Vietnam today, flying the next. The one-officer pilots were very, very good, like us, once we had our experience. Once we got our 300 hours up, it's true, we could do any bloody thing with the aeroplane. And did. And because we were good at what we wanted, what we did, we were just accepted as pilots. I remember one very funny day, if I've got the time, nearly, we landed at Long Bin to collect fuel. Now, Long Bin was Westmoreland's home base, and I tell you, our aircraft were dirty, were no doors, there was anything inside that you thought you might need for the day, and we were pretty dirty and unkempt at the best of times anyway. I'm leading this lot. I've got an American first lieutenant who's only done a week or two in country flying with me learning the ropes, and up walks this very, very sharply creased, beautifully ironed out third colonel. Who's in charge of these aeroplanes? I am. What's up? I don't want a foreigner, I want an American. And he proceeded to chew my first lieutenant out with me intervening, telling him to bugger off. It's none of his business, because we hadn't parked neatly in a row at his fuel plant. No, we did well. We did all right. Yes, look, there's always a love-hate relationship at some stage, and they occurred, but nothing to write home.
I was also looking at the technical issues of transforming yourselves from flying ships like Wessex to the Iroquois as well.
Oh, we'd all had Iroquois back home. Yeah, Navy had 4 or 5 Iroquois on 723 squadron, so we did a bit of flying there. I think they're only C models? Yeah. B models, no, B models with a big engine, wasn't it? Yeah, anyway, whatever. Same horse, different jockey.
We could discuss those